Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to share this this session of our small course on deliberative and crowdsourced constitution making processes. Today we have the honor to have Paul Blokker with us. Paul Blokker is a full professor of political sociology, although he also does a lot of legal sociology. And today we are gonna discuss his latest volume, which is this one, Imagining Europe, Transnational Contestation and Civic Populism. In the light of this book, we are going to discuss also the probably that very important experiment that was a conference on the future of Europe, although the book, I mean, goes beyond that. It's really a series of fantastic chapters. It's a collection edited by Paul. Paul is a full professor at the University of Bologna. He graduated in political science at the University of Amsterdam. He holds a doctorate from the European University Institute. His research interests that include sociology of constitutional law. Indeed, he also recently edited another impressive volume, Sociological Constitutionalism, edited with Chris Tornil and published by Cambridge University Press. He also edited many other important volumes. He authored brilliant scholarly pieces in very different fields. I want to just mention that is one of the most interesting voices in the field of populism studies. Indeed, is a piece published in the International Journal of Constitutional Law and devoted to populist constitutionalism has been very inspiring. I've been inspired a lot by his research. So I'm very happy that he immediately accepted to join us in this venture. And I'm also speaking on behalf of Matteo Monti, who is the co-director of this course. Having said that, Paul, thank you very much. We are very grateful, and we look forward to discussing your book. Ready where you are.
Okay, thank you so much for this very generous introduction. It makes me almost blush. I'm very happy to be with you also because I think this is a really great course on a very difficult topic and actually something that I've been working on for quite a while now. In a couple of weeks, I'm going back to Iceland, Reykjavik, to discuss deliberative constitution making and that kind of stuff, which makes me really happy because in a way that's where it for me started, thinking about processes of constitution reform, constitution making, and different ways of involving citizens. But I have to admit, thinking a little bit about the book and the book launch, which is a bit a slow launch because the book has been out for a year or so, I suppose, but it doesn't matter. I think it's still pretty timely. But thinking about that book in this context makes me a bit nervous in a way, because it's a very complex topic. I mean, already, as many of you will know, discussions about constitution making and different forms of civic participation, they are there, they're ever more important, but it remains a rather kind of niche type of discussion. Well, if you then link that niche discussion to civic participation in constitutional drafting and treaty change processes with regard to the European Union, it becomes even more esoteric, I'm afraid. But that's exactly what I propose to be discussing today. And I should also make clear, as I will do in a second, that the book discusses these dimensions, but it also has other concerns, much more broadly speaking, relating to issues of civil society, transnational activism, transnational populism, these types of matters. But let me briefly keep you on the same page so you know where at least my plan is to go heading today in our discussion. That is, first, I would say a couple of things, would like to say a couple of things about where the volume comes from, what its basis is, what kind of discussions you can find in the volume. But then I will link it particularly to the third discussion. I will link it particularly to the third part of the volume, which indeed talks about constituent issues, constitutionalism, particularly related to the transnational dimension. And that's exactly the second part then that I want to address today. And thirdly, which is in the end, admittedly, only a tiny part in my own chapter in the volume, I will relate it to the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is something I've been really very much involved in, and I still try to follow what is going on, but it's impressive how quickly it disappears behind the horizon of all kinds of other much more urgent matters, it seems, which is a real shame, I think, a real missed opportunity. But my discussion will be particularly around to what extent can we see the Conference on the Future of Europe as some kind of constituent event, as some kind of event related to forms of constitutional change, not least because, of course, it has been promoted and it has seen very impressive forms of citizen participation in many ways. So also for that reason, it needs careful scrutiny, I think. But let me start with the start, and that is indeed this volume on Imagining Europe, which actually comes from a project that I was running with money from the Czech grant agency Gotcha when I was working at the Charles University in Prague. And so I coordinated this project for 4 years at Charles University, involving a number of doctoral students in common research, indeed, on what we called in the project, which had this acronym TRAPPED, and this actually stood for Transnational Populism and European Democracy. Populism was an important component in the project, but not necessarily its core component. But as you know, if you want to secure research money, you better put some kind of popular adjective into your proposal, because otherwise you probably won't get any money. But then again, I have to admit, the volume in particular, and also the project itself then, ultimately did importantly reflect on a specific type of populism, which one could call left-wing transnational populism, and we will come back to that a little bit later on as well. And so this is a project of which the core focus was actually on transnational forms of mobilization, civil society activism around the project of European integration. And it had a particular focus on a number of actors, like the most important one was definitely the Democracy in Europe movement, which, as many of you might know, is a transnational movement set up by Yanis Varoufakis, the former finance minister of Greece, set up in 2016. It still exists, but I think it's going through a phase of great difficulties. But it's an interesting example of an actor that includes certain forms of populist behavior, claims making, etc., but at the same time is definitely not Eurosceptic. It's definitely not going against European integration, but rather proposes a series of pretty radical views of change of the European project. And that made it particularly interesting for us, for the populist discussion, for the transnational activist discussion, but also, and that's my own sort of nerdy academic niche, that is the constituent dimension, what I will later call the dimension of constitutional mobilization. But so we looked at DiEM25, but we actually looked at also at a number of other actors, like there's another actor called European Alternatives, has been active since 2006. And one of the reasons was set up was actually as a reaction to the failed constitutional experiment of the mid 2000s, so to speak. And also actually in the book, we also address to a certain extent, particularly in my own chapter, another actor. And I see that actually some people who engage with that actor are also present, like Max Steuer. And that is an actor called Citizens Take Over Europe, which is actually a trans-European civil society network. And I myself, I'm active in that network, so I better put that up front. Any normative bias is on purpose, so to speak. And yeah, maybe between parentheses, I should also say that I don't think it's really possible to do academic research on issues like constitution making without having a specific politically, ideologically informed position. In my case, it's definitely a position that is very much interested and believes in a way, a constitution and a constitutionalism that is closer to actual citizens, and that includes citizen participation in some form. So I should put that up front. That makes also clear some of the arguments I will make during today's discussion. There are three parts to the volume, and the first part indeed is a part that particularly addresses something that is really, really problematic and really cumbersome, I think, and that is the difficulties of transnational mobilization. And of course, you don't only see this in civil society. I guess you could make similar arguments for transnational mobilization within the institutions or on the level of political parties. The difficulties of form truly transnational political parties, for instance. But so anyone interested in that, I think there are really, really strong chapters in that first part that describe, but also critically reflect on how difficult it is to create forms of European identity, to create forms of European commonality. And of course, this is in certain ways closer to discussions on European studies, more in a narrow sense, and also to social movement studies. But it's equally important, I think, for the constitutional dimension, because it's very difficult to see how one could have a virtuous European constitutional dimension without having some kind of common identity, without having some kind of broader political community that recognizes itself as in need of a constitutional pact, so to speak. So this is an important part, and it's very critical on the capacity and the possibility of actually mobilizing on a transnational level. Then the second part of the book is really interested in the question of populism, and particularly tries to carve out the dimension of left-wing populism, which obviously is not a singular dimension of populism. There are different varieties within left populism itself, for instance, relating to questions of national sovereignty, questions of Lexit, to put it in terms of European matters. And it includes a fragile, a less visible perhaps, but it includes a level of transnational left populism. And so that part of the volume discusses left populism from theoretical dimensions, for instance, referring to Laclau, and Chantal Mouffe's work on left populism. And it also takes up the transnational level. And one particular chapter I think is particularly rich is a chapter which is by one of my doctoral students, Christian Stam, that addresses the economic dimension, which is a dimension often overlooked, but extremely important if we want to understand populism better. But let us get to the third part, which is closer to our concerns here, I suppose. And that part is indeed particularly geared towards constituent dimensions, pouvoir constituant, constitutionalism, constitutional mobilization, or more broadly speaking, perhaps legal mobilization, and the whole ongoing debate on European treaties, European treaty chains, European constitution, and indeed the issue of the future of Europe. And in that sense, as it happens to all of us, the project unfortunately was on its last legs when the conference on the future of Europe actually started. So we were already in the last year of the project. We could only take it on board in a more fragmented manner, which is a shame, I think, because particularly also from this dimension, I believe the Conference on the Future of Europe raises an enormous amount of important issues related to European treaty change, to imagining, as the book calls it, or reimagining the future of the European integration project. And that's also the starting point of the project Trapped, but also the volume itself. And that brings me indeed to the introduction to the volume. And that is the idea that, or the observation basically, that the European institutions, the European project, the European elites seem to be stuck in some kind of imaginatory stasis. That is, according to our project, according to many contributors to the volume as well, we see a European project that seems largely unable, if we look at its elites and institutions, to really engage in what you could call an imaginative creativity regarding to the EU's future. And you see that, for instance, you would call this in international law a form of backlash, but you see this in the increasing relevance of forces within the European Union that call for all kinds of forms of return to national sovereignty, even if at the same time, of course, we see other tendencies that go right up to the supranational, transnational levels, like defense and things like that. But in general, I think it's true that the European project finds itself stuck in a kind of reproductive imagination. And so it proposes going forward in a kind of incremental fashion without important changes to its main rules, to its main institutions. You see that, and we'll come back to that later, particularly in the context of the debate on treaty change. There's a great resistance to any kind of idea of reopening up the treaties. There's even more resistance to a full-blown, let's say, proposal of having another constitutional convention, which might even lead to, indeed, replacing the whole of the current treaty system in favor of an explicit political constitution of the European Union. And so there's a lack of imagination, it seems to me, amongst the elites. And that also means that the core problems from a democratic constitutional dimension of the EU remain in place. The core gap, the key reason, at least in rhetoric, of why the Conference on the Future of Europe was put forward was that the EU needs to face its democratic deficit, right? Its lack of democratic legitimacy, the increase of Eurosceptic, right-wing populist forces and their standing within the European Parliament, etc. And so the Conference of the Future of Europe was supposed to close that gap, but in reality, very little has happened. And so the core problem remains, it seems to me, a very broad and intense in many ways societal legitimacy deficit. In set of institutions that remains largely disembedded, you might say, from broader societal perspectives, discussions, interpretations, debate, etc. And so, yeah, in that sense, the volume is nothing new because it puts the finger on the sore spot, and that is the EU keeps on suffering from a clear democratic deficit. It keeps on even suffering from what one could call a constitutional deficit, and it would need, in my view at least, to tap into creative solutions, to change course, to come up with ways in which European citizens and non-citizens are much more intensely related to the European project, but we don't see much happening on this level so far. And that's another claim in the project. One source of creative ideas, I'm not saying it's the only one, but one sort of depository where one could go and shop for creative ideas is, in our view, definitely, let's say, a more progressive, a Euro-critical, but not a Eurosceptic dimension of European transnationally operating civil society, and as we call it in the project, trans-European movements. And so those movements, they criticize the European Union exactly for this lack of imagination, for this being stuck in a kind of hegemonic project with its specific views of what the EU is about, without any propensity to creatively change the institutions. And so you might also say the European integration project is largely hostage to what you could see as modernist imaginaries of, in particular, state sovereignty. And it's not able to overcome that dimension. Actually, it's backsliding, if you want to use that term in this particular context, it's backsliding to an what in my view would be a largely obsolete idea of the nation state, which strangely returned in recent years as a major claim, as a major argument of many political and other actors. And so civil society actors are then the sort of the irritating force. That's exactly what I, by the way, also try to do when I normally teach, so I might do this in this occasion as well. I try to irritate my students. But in a positive way, I hope. And so that's one way of, by the way, trying to mobilize our imaginative forces, right? If one's irritated, one's settled knowledge is being questioned. And so one needs to rethink what that knowledge actually means. And I think civil society actors tend to do this, particularly then indeed those more critical ones. And so radical imagination then here means a capacity to go beyond largely unquestioned core imaginaries, like indeed the most important one, I think, is state sovereignty. But we can see similar things with regard to representative democracy. And when we discuss the Conference on the Future of Europe, this emerges as well. I mean, one of the interesting dimensions of the conference is that it created something, a citizens panel or a citizens assembly, which in a way is in tension with representative democracy. Now that we know that this can actually work, it's out there, but very few politicians in particular are willing to embrace this type of idea. Why? Because representative democracy is seen as something you cannot really question. That's the core of democracy. Is this really so? I'm not so sure. Representative democracy is an historical project. It emerged for a historical reason. It could be changed again. And so the radical imagination questions indeed whether representative democracy might still be the main way of institutionalizing and realizing democracy in contemporary times. You could also think, by the way, of economic issues, the question of growth, the question of the capitalist functioning needs, I would argue, a radical reimagination, but we see very little of this so far actually happening within the institutions. I'm sorry, I'm going a bit too fast with the slides. And so I'm following a bit, as I do in the book as well, the work of Günter Teutner here, who on the one hand is perhaps not useful for our discussion, but because he deeply despises any political idea of constitutions, and he has definitely a rather radical view towards nation states. There, maybe he's again more helpful, but he's also extremely interesting in his work on transnational forms of constitutionalism and the role of what one could call outsiders or non-institutional actors. Indeed, in our case, these might be social and protest movements, NGOs, civic associations, etc., that observe, that take on a kind of counter-democratic role, as Pierre-Rosan Vallon would call it, by observing politics from the outside in a very critical fashion. And so in this sense, they engage indeed in some kind of, as Teutner also labels it, some kind of pouvoir irritant, an irritating, and you could of course also trace this to Luhmannian language of systems theory, or one could use the term destituent power. And so in a way, a critical force that criticizes the current status quo, the current establishment arrangements. But in my view, there's also something that goes beyond that, at least in some cases, and that is proposals, positive proposals for change, constituent designs. Like currently, there's maybe if there's one debate that has survived the Conference on the Future of Europe, it is about citizens' assemblies, mini publics, deliberative assemblies, etc. And the number of European actors are promoting this idea pretty actively in an idea of institutionalizing within the current European landscape. And of course, the more radical your proposal is, the more it would change the European Union's institutional landscape, and the more it would lead to forms of what you would call redistribution of political power. And so, in that sense, changing the hegemonic setup of the current European status quo. Potentially, of course, I'm not saying that this will actually happen, because that's the political realism needs to be factored in as well, of course. But I find this, ways of putting this in terms of imagination, in terms of imaginaries, I find this particularly helpful. Because first of all, it teases out something that I think is really essential, although it's very difficult to research, and that is a distinction between what one could call reproductive and productive imagination. Reproductive imagination, particularly reproducing existing structures, reproducing the status quo, not being able to imagining a different future that is more or less radically alternative to what we have now. And so if we see nervous members of European Parliament when we talk about citizens' assemblies, or where we see outrightly unfriendly members of the European Council when it is about European citizens' assemblies, we see that they are stuck in their reproductive imagination. They can't really imagine a different democratic setup of the EU. But that's exactly the imagination that radical actors tap into. And they put the existing status quo to the test using what you could call productive imagination. In a critical sense, so pointing to let's say, the genealogy of the current European Union's power structures, etc. But there's also a dimension of, okay, we don't like the current setup. how could we imagine a different system then? And so there, the productive imagination might step in, using novel ideas of how to shape the European Union. And yeah, as it always happens, when I start thinking, I start scribbling. And so here you see one of my scribblings. And I think it's an interesting way of putting it. Let's say the current status quo has been irritated. I mean, the Conference of the Future of Europe was supposed to think about the future of Europe, right? It wasn't supposed to just say, okay, everything is okay, let's continue the way it is. So the Conference on the Future of Europe was, in a way, an imaginative exercise. But as I tried to point out here, that imagination is blocked, is obstructed, is made difficult by a number of key forces. That is, first of all, of course, forms of hegemony, of domination, of institutional domination, of political party domination. And this could change if more robust forms of civic empowerment would be put into place. This is not necessarily happening. I don't really think this really happened with the Conference on the Future of Europe either. But of course, the more you would allow societal actors, citizens themselves, to, well, on the one hand, publicly deliberate, but in a more robust version of citizen involvement, they would also have some kind of say on the outcome, on the follow-up of deliberations, of policy making, policy change. The more you would allow for that, the more creative imagination, productive imagination might potentially emerge. And that might indeed then shift the dominant imaginaries towards different visions of what the European Union is about. In practice, of course, this is very difficult to bring about because indeed the reproductive imagination remains most closely related to the power structures, to the institutions, to the dominant political parties, and so on. And so indeed, the core premise of the book then is that transnational social movements might help demask domination, might help constructing alternative narratives based on productive, creative imagination, on innovation. And so they might engage in what you would call creative hermeneutics and stimulate new ideas, stimulate semantic innovation. I mean, the wildest one I heard was there is a kind of debate on replacing the House of Lords in the UK, right? Well, there's one organization, if I'm not mistaken, it's called the Sortition. Why not replace the House of Lords by a full-blown, randomly selected, citizen-populated citizen assembly? Spectacular idea, I suppose, but clearly also a very radical one, which would very radically change, in this case, what self-professed is the oldest democracy in the world, the UK, towards a very different type of system. And so, well, I will stop now with this slide, I suppose, the conceptual, theoretical discussion on imagination, etc. But this one is just to keep us on the same page in a way, inspired by Ricoeur, his classical discussions on ideology and utopia, where you would have ideology, the closer it gets to power, and of course, particularly when it gets into power, it starts it starts to freeze up, so to speak. It starts to petrify, indeed. It becomes an inflexible ideological vision of the world. And so there it remains stuck in what you could call indeed the reproductive imagination. Ideology doesn't start out like that. Ideology normally emerges as a critique on the existing arrangements, as Paul Ricoeur rightly argued, but it remains, and that's the gray sort of diagonal line in the middle, it remains stuck in reality, what we perceive as existing reality. Utopia is on the other side. It's on the side of the world, as you could call it. And I use this distinction from Luc Boltanski in his book on critique, but he takes it from Wittgenstein. And so the difference between reality and world is reality is what is actually currently institutionalized. World refers to any institutional alternative we might think up. So it's the endless amount of possibilities out there that we could think of. That's where utopia steps in. Utopia bringing us into a indeed world of imagination, where we are allowed to rethink without being too much obsessed with Article 48 of TEU says this and this about treaty change. We can only follow those rules. It's a bit like Koskeniemi's managerial mindset against the Kantian mindset, the imaginative mindset, the mindset that allows for radically rethinking our existing realities. And so maybe this slide is the one that most importantly represents the book, although you can't find it in the book. It's still in the scribbling phase, as you can see it. But it's definitely close to some of its sentiment, so to speak. So this clash between hegemonic views of what, in our case, the European Union is supposedly about, the clash against those views and views that look for a different, in some cases, radically different order. Well, here you see one example of one of the institutions that is designed, I suppose, to kill imagination. That's the European Council. In this case, it's one of its reports on the Conference on the Future of Europe, where it sort of technically assesses the various recommendations that came out of the Conference on the Future of Europe. And as you can see, it claims that only a very limited number of measures would require treaty change in order to be fully implemented. And so basically, it does what most of the times the Commission does as well. It claims that, well, okay, we had this Conference on the Future of Europe. We uprooted 800 citizens to deliberate on the future of Europe, but actually everything is already there. And we have already been doing this anyhow. And so basically they implicitly say, I suppose this was a useless exercise, but they will never say that explicitly, I guess. And so the Council and its reaction also to the European Parliament's resolutions on treaty change, the Council clearly takes a position, no, we don't want to change anything. And indeed, what hovers behind this is the imaginary of state sovereignty. The states are the masters of the treaties. We don't discuss this. This is out of any discussion, which is, of course, a huge problem if one wants to think of more creative change. Some parties, though, do that. This is a Facebook post of Volt Europe, of Volt Europa, of the 4th of May, where they actually say the Conference of the Future of Europe was a citizens' assembly. That citizens' assembly itself recommended that this type of participatory instrument would be made permanent within the European Union. Where is this going? Whom is taking this up? Whom is actually institutionalizing it? So Volt Europe seems to be closer in that view to a view that is willing to reshuffle institutional setup, etc. But of course, one could add many other examples to this, going from federalists to much more radical European leftists. And so another dimension then is indeed that even if in EU studies, and I guess also in EU law, there's often, as William Biebuik has called it, an air of we know what the EU is. A lawyer would indeed say, I know my treaty law, and so I know what it is. And so there's little to be discussed there. In reality, I think, and that's what this book is doing, and also a number of papers that are stuck in the reviewing pipeline of journals are elaborating indeed various narratives of the European project that are actually in great contrast between each other. And so another premise of the book then is indeed that we need to recognize there are very different proposals out there, very different assessments of the European Union, and that actually indeed brings us to very different assessments of what needs to be happening. And so one thing I do in the introduction of the book is then distinguishing between 4 different types of positions towards a future of the European Union. One could be called reformist prosaic, reformist unimaginative. Incremental change is its main idea, maybe strengthening certain policies, but not really changing anything radical. This would be in contrast to radical prosaic positions. These would still depart from the existing reality, but they would be more willing to rethink things, to come up, for instance, with new functions of existing institutions, or change around the functions of existing institutions. So there is a little bit more radicality there. One can also look at arguments that all the way through are more imaginative. Think of a reformist imaginative argument where more radical changes are allowed for. So let's say reformism in its heart wouldn't really want to change representative democratic institutions, or even more broadly speaking, the technocratic nature of the EU. A reformist imaginative position might allow for some change. Maybe the European Commission citizens panels currently are an example, maybe not. It's a bit in a gray zone, I suppose. Radical imaginative for the more radical Democrats amongst us is where one would want to go. And so that would be adopting structurally novel institutions. Maybe the House of Lords change into a citizens' assembly might be put into this type of category. That is, indeed, by changing an existing, a core institution into something completely different, you really radically change the political landscape, the political institutional constellations. Okay, so that was roughly the book. There's much more in it. There's the whole debate on populism that's interesting. There's a whole debate on mobilization, social movements, etc. But I don't want to go too much into that because we don't have so much time, I'm afraid. And so let's focus on the constitutional dimension, the constitutional deficit, and something I tend to call constituent activism. And so, of course, we know that the original Convention on the Future of Europe of 2002-2003, it didn't make it in the end. It did produce a draft constitution, but it didn't lead to a politically adopted public constitution, you might say. It really led to how to put it? One clear consequence of this failed convention was a kind of tabooization of the constitutional matter as such. So hardly anyone since 2005, when the referenda were held in France and the Netherlands, seriously wants to propose some kind of constitutional convention. Even today, by the way, there are very few actors that call for that. Those that consider treaty change most of the times are still thinking of sort of partial treaty change, not a full-blown constitutionalization exercise. But at the same time, I think it's fair to argue that the EU suffers from a constitutional deficit. There's no original popular endorsement of the EU through a constitution-making process, but there are also a whole range of issues that would need, let's call it constitutionalization, that would need at the very minimum treaty change. In my view, that includes the democratic story, but we have a whole bunch of other things on the table. The militarization of the EU, a European defense community. My home country was invaded by the Germans at the start of the Second World War. Today, its army, the Dutch army, is fused with the German army. if this is a broader process of creating indeed a European army, it would be very difficult to imagine doing this without serious change in the European Union's treaties. There are very many other matters, health policy, energy policy, but also much more clearly closer to our concerns here, perhaps citizen participation, European citizenship. It seems very difficult to not, at some stage now, engage in the change of the treaties of the European Union. If not, indeed, even a full-blown constitutionalization process of the EU as such. But it remains a taboo. And even with the Conference on the Future of Europe, it shows that this taboo status has not been unearthed, has not been overcome. Even if it has to be admitted that some actors have for some time now, and of course, in this case, the European Parliament has always been the one that is more willing to imagine and to be creatively imaginative. It already was so in the case of the Conference of the Future of Europe, that initially didn't even foresee core citizens panels, but also because of the European Parliament's endorsement, this ultimately did become part of the process. But already in 2017, it called in a resolution for a constituent process, treaty amendment, perhaps even a new convention. So there clearly is ongoing debate, even if many actors are very hesitant to engage with these types of debates. And so this more particularly relates to my own chapter in the book, which is the last chapter. So hardly anyone will get to it, I suppose. But yeah, well, that's also a good idea to highlight it a little bit more. So what I try to do there is, on the one hand, in the line with prior work I've done also in domestic context, it tries to contribute to discussions about the relation between civil society movements and constitutional politics, and in our particular case, transnational movements and European constitutional politics. And the second aim then is to indeed to analyze in a more descriptive manner what is going on, what has been going on, and what are the core claims that come out of civil society actors, that come out of, as we call it in the book, trans-European movements that strongly call for change. And so, as I already said, this taps directly into the idea that the EU, even if it's a taboo, but it does face a constitutional deficit. As Dario Castiglione already called it in the 90s, this deficit has to do with a kind of under-the-radar constitutionalization, the good old integration through law argument, the European Court taking the forefront of constitutionalization, but not using the classical political constitution-making processes, and perhaps even more importantly, the wider public, that much decried absence of a European society, European public sphere, etc. That whole sphere indeed isn't even aware, if it exists, of the need for or the existence of constitutional dimensions, one might say. So there's a great discrepancy between a kind of constitution by stealth of the European Union, of course mentioned then in case law like Lever famously and others, but the wider society is largely unaware of this, doesn't really realize that there are very hard constitutional dimensions to the European treaties, for instance. That's, by the way, a huge challenge for any kind of civil society movement. If you want to mobilize people, how do you make clear to them that something as boring as a constitution is actually should be of their direct concern? That remains, I think, a very difficult issue to deal with. And so a constitutional deficit which you could also put in more social legal terms as a gap between an existing material constitution as EU rules that de facto have constitutional status, and on the other hand, then indeed the lack of an explicit political constitution that can claim legitimacy, like, I don't know, the Italian Constitution and its founding fathers and mothers, or the US Constitution and its founding fathers and the constitutional moment of the late 18th century, etc. There's nothing like that in Europe. I mean, if you think about it, Europe Day, the 9th of May, what does it celebrate? A kind of technocratic free trade agreement type of thing, not a constitutional moment. It's impressive if you think about it. The lack, the abyss that the European Union actually has in terms of a constitutional pedigree. And so there are all kinds of dimensions to that. Indeed, the original sin, there is no real constitutional moment in the EU, and if there ever was one, it's a long spun out judicial activist type of story rather than citizens that can claim we the people type of arguments. And if the convention ever was a real constitutional moment, it really failed. And it didn't really include, let's be fair about it, the wider population, except for in referenda ex post, but not in the actual debate on what the constitution was supposed to be looking like. And so that also means there's a problem of democratization. I know this goes against the grain of some that argue that actually the fact that the EU is based on a kind of indirect democratic legitimacy through the member states, that's more than sufficient. For me, it's an argument that never really convinced me, I have to say, also because of what I just said. If we agree that the EU by now has a constitutional dimension, then it's simply not sufficient that we can have some kind of indirect effect on that EU constitutional edifice through the member states. One would need direct engagement, it seems to me, and that lacks. And that's exactly what Carlo Tuori, for instance, called the lack of a kind of civic constitutional culture, also related to the lack of an explicit political EU constitutional dimension. People are not aware of it because it doesn't really exist, you might say. And so there's a problem of democratization. There's the good old problem of the EU, to a large extent, remains an economic powerhouse, a market project, a super single market. Much of the constitutional rules is about the economic dimensions. Very few is actually about political, axiological, and all kinds of other functions that constitutions are supposed to be having. And so there's I fully say, as Andrew Rato has argued, the EU treaties lack in constitutionalism. Their Article 48 in that sense is not your classical amendment rule, because ultimately it sticks to veto power, and so singular member states being able to stop change, whereas a serious amendment rule is about building consensus. And so, like in the Italian case, as Giuseppe and others will know, it's back on the table, the idea of constitutional reform. Well, there you need to carefully construct in a number of points in time a wider consensus to be able to change the constitution. In the EU, it's enough that just one country says, no, I don't like this, and you can block the whole thing, which is peculiar. And so there's a kind of absence of a constitutionalist dimension to the current setup. Many have tried to change this over time, and that also, I think, is an unwritten story yet of the European integration process. I find it fascinating. For instance, already in the 90s, of course, there were major players or major or civil society players trying to make a claim for democratic change of the European Union. They became particularly visible in a way with the European Convention in the early 2000s. And I put some here on the slide, like Democracy International, a European referendum campaign, Meer Demokratie, a German civic association. They ultimately managed to, for instance, put the European Citizens Initiative into the draft constitution, which actually made it then into the Lisbon Treaty, as we know. And so some kind of impact they did have. And so also in that sense, we can see what is going on right now with the Conference on the Future of Europe, and in the wake of the Conference of the Future of Europe, a sort of ongoing process of mobilization, for many citizens completely invisible, but for some citizens a relevant process, where the attempt is to democratize and to up to certain extent also to constitutionalize the European Union. And so that's a really interesting dimension, I think, to any kind of constitution-making process. Forms of mobilization in society can take very different forms depending on the context, democratic context, non-democratic, authoritarian contexts, and in our case, a complex transnational context where a real broad public sphere is not really existing. And so to make claims, as mobilization is often about, or to protest, is actually much more difficult than in a specific national context. This is a dimension I think is rarely discussed. When constitutional mobilization by civic actors is discussed, it has been done mostly by American political scientists talking about litigation processes, not even necessarily related to the EU, but maybe closer to the European Court of Human Rights. But there are interesting processes going on, I would argue, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the chapter. And so forms of mobilization around the constitutional idea of the EU, claims being made around constitutional issues. And constitutional mobilization, in that sense, is in a way a term that derives from social movement studies, although they don't use it. It's a kind of the original sort of civil society mobilization, but then focused on those aspects that relate to law, that relate to constitutional dimensions, that relate to human rights, for instance. That would be the broader legal mobilization issue. And as one scholar has called it, it's a process by which social actors employ constitutional norms and discourses to advocate for constitutional change. But it remains a hardly discussed notion. I myself have been trying to contribute a bit to this argument, and here you see a list of things that is non-exhaustive, but it does identify a number of things that social actors, civil society actors might engage in when trying to engage in constitutional mobilization. One of them might be litigation, which is a part I find really, really interesting, I have to say, and there are all kinds of different dimensions. By the way, it's not only litigation in the narrow sense, it's also about the friends of the court type of arguments. It's about monitoring by civil society actors of implementation of court decisions. So that in itself is already a really interesting part, but there are other parts too. Maybe parts that lawyers tend to address much less, and that is advocacy, lobbying the institutions, lobbying political parties, lobbying members of European Parliament in upcoming elections. There we have one for next year, for instance. Engaging indeed with the political institutional dimensions. Then there is the street fighting dimension, the street protest, mobilization, public debates, organization of bottom-up assemblies, where also constitutional claims can be made. And then finally, a very specific dimension, which is particularly interesting, I think, but maybe in some ways it relates more to authoritarian societies, but not only, and that is what one could call constitutional contestation and constitutional resistance. Think of contemporary Poland and the mobilization of judges and of civil society actors against the existing illiberal government. There it's a kind of not proposing a new constitution, that's the issue, but rather trying to respect the old constitution. In another country like Hungary, the discussion seems to be going in a very different direction. It is, what kind of constitution would we need when we finally got rid of that overweight dictator that we have in power, Mr. Orban. I hope he's not a participant of our discussion here. But anyhow, so forms of constitutional contestation, resistance, where we start talking more about forms of lawfare, if you would want to call it like that, than peaceful civil society mobilization. But definitely a very interesting part of the story. Another way of putting it, and I'm borrowing here a bit from a scholar called Peter Niesen, you could look at constitutional claims by looking at different dimensions, like forms of what you could call constituent articulation. So where you try to make claims in order to have an influence on policy proposals, on treaty change proposals, etc. That's more focused on the institutions. You could think of constituent activation, where civil society actors from the bottom up try to have an effect on the process. And so, for instance, by organizing civil society-based assemblies on the European Constitution outside of the institutional sphere. Then you could think of, indeed, I call it here, original constituent action, where by means of disobedience, you try to irritate, so to speak, the existing institutions. Again, a constituent assembly fully set up by citizens might be an example of this. And then finally, and this is the rarest form, I think, is where actors actually call for a full-blown new European constitution. DiEM25 has done that, but then it disappeared again from its agenda. And there are other actors now discussing this as well, including, for instance, the federalists, who are much more, of course, represented within the institutions as such. I guess time-wise, I need to get to an end, right, Giuseppe? So let me see if I manage to do that.
Yeah, I think that you still have 4 minutes if you want to conclude.
4 minutes, you said?
Yeah, 4 minutes.
Okay, oh, that's very generous.
I am very generous.
Okay. Thanks so much. So I will refer to the book itself if you want to explore this kind of stuff further, but you will find some handsome tables, I think, that you can use to look at. Of course, this is simplifying, looking at only 4 different positions one might have towards treaty change, for instance, but it echoes a bit what I said before about productive and reproductive formation, etc. Here is one at the end of the chapter where I look at different existing proposals. You will remember perhaps the one of a couple of years ago called TDEM, with people like Piketty involved, where the argument was basically for a kind of parliamentarization of the EU, not extremely radical, but still a call for democratization. On the right, you see the Spinelli group, which in a way is imaginative, but you might also say that in many ways, and I hope Giuseppe now doesn't become very angry, but that the federalist argument is at the same time very inelastic. And so it's stuck in a historical imagination, which is not very willing to change. And so it's in some ways radical, but it's also in some ways past-oriented, let's put it like that. Then we get 2 other ones, Citizens Take Over Europe and another civil organization at the European level, Civic, calling indeed for important reforms, to address the democratic deficit by means of a permanent transnational forum of citizen deliberation. And so that would be indeed one example of the idea of institutionalizing citizens' assemblies. And then finally, the most radical one, DiEM25, left radical movement, where the argument is to start up a full-blown bottom-up constitutional assembly. It never came off the ground, but the proposal is there. And it's clearly a claim towards what the future of a European constitution-making process should be looking like. And so such claims all have many obstacles to face, unfortunately. First of all, should it be the institutions, or should citizens also be involved in constitution-making processes? I'm sure you have discussed this also in the other lectures. The second issue is indeed whether we do need some treaty change within the limits of the treaties, or whether we actually need a full-blown constitution for the European Union as such. The third question might be whether we need to very carefully follow Article 48 EU to change the treaties, or whether we can actually think of something more imaginative, as has happened in many of these constitution-making processes, thinking of Chile, Ireland, Iceland, and so on. Might this be possible on the EU level? I don't know, but and that's I still have 1 minute, minus 1 minute, I suppose, Giuseppe, so I will be very quick.
Yes.
The Conference on the Future of Europe might, at least in some ways, be seen as an impressive, imaginative exercise, something that didn't exist before. It included a whole bunch of dimensions like you see here in the middle, the citizens panels, with 800 selected, randomly selected citizens. Nothing really done, or actually it has been done on the European level, but it wasn't really visible. This was supposed to be a public event, and so definitely imaginative steps forward. Held for 1 year, as you will know, between the 9th of May 21, 9th of May 22, came up with a whole bunch of recommendations. Originally, that's important to remind ourselves, the Conference of the Future of Europe indeed explicitly claimed to empower citizens, to make it a bottom-up process. In Macron's words, in a joint non-paper of France and Germany, these terms were being used. And so, in some ways, the Conference of the Future of Europe can actually be seen as having had some kind of constituent promise, let's call it like that, or at least it took the form as, for instance, in the Icelandic experience in 2010, 2011, where they also had assemblies, it took the form of a kind of preparation, right? So come up with ideas that then a real constituent assembly could be taking up. This never happened in the Conference on the Future of Europe process, but that's what it looked like. And in many ways, in that sense, it did seem to have some kind of constituent dimension, also in its plenary, which seemed very similar to the convention's plenary of 2003. Okay, so finally then, we could argue, I think, but please feel free to dramatically criticize me on this, that the COFI, the Conference on the Future of Europe, seemed to be echoing some kind of constituent exercise. Its recommendations include a number of treaty change dimensions. Think of abolishing unanimity, or indeed the setup of a robust permanent citizens' assembly, but it hasn't led to any clear constitution-making path. So on the one hand, we have an image, let's put it like that, of important involvement of citizens in policy and treaty change dimensions. On the other hand, we have the robust, reproductive status quo imagination of the institutions, and it seems to be stopping there. And that's where I stop too. I'm looking really forward to the discussion.